I'm Martin Wolf. I'm the Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times. The underlying idea, which is also a value in democracy, is that of citizenship. Citizens are active, engaged, and they are committed to the whole. You have to accept the legitimacy of people who disagree with you and their right to power if they win. And to do that, I think, you have to have a sense that your citizenship, your being part of the society as a whole, is more important than your identification with the people who happen to agree with you today. If you want a democracy to survive, the middle classes, the middle of, you know what we mean, the people in the middle of the income distribution need to feel they are powerful, they are listened to, they are respected, and they have a real say. And that depends in large part on their being prosperous enough to be independent, to have the time to get engaged in politics, not to be isolated from the rest, and above all, not to feel that there's an elite ruling over them, that there is respect for them. This is a very difficult balance. This is why democracy is so fragile. And it seems to me obvious that in many parts of the world, including our countries, we have lost those conditions, or at least made them very fragile. It's perfectly possible that, particularly under stress, particularly in times of conflict, internal or external, that human societies naturally tend to congregate around a charismatic leader. It simplifies decision making and it provides a focus for trust. And if you cease, in particular, to trust institutions and the people who run institutions because they seem to be dysfunctional, the natural tendency of human beings seems to be to trust a charismatic, great leader. And this is repeated innumerable times in human history. The question then you ask is, okay, if that's the case and we want to preserve democracy and we want to have it last, then how do we do this institutionally? I put forward what I call a New Deal at the economic side, and I suggest a number of fairly complex political reforms, but it's also about employment subsidies, about job security, and minimum wages, which I've come round to. I wasn't in favor 20 years ago. I am now properly down. I don't want to go back to the trades unions of the 1970s. And I think it is completely reasonable that the most successful members of our society should pay these taxes. Many don't pay hardly anything at all. And that's part of the rent extraction because they can buy the politicians who will support them. And that links with my very strong desire to reduce the role of money in politics. I'm not in favor of a universal basic income. I think it's ill-targeted and too expensive. A lot of reform is needed of our bureaucratic systems, making them more expert, and if anything, in some important ways, more independent. A huge concern is the role of the media and the way the media now works. As public service broadcasting deteriorates, everybody goes into an echo chamber. There's no longer a common set of shared facts. I do think we need to start thinking about what a common media space would look like for democracy in the future. I think we're beginning to think about this, and with artificial intelligence now, I think that with the possibility of immensely sophisticated fakery, this issue is even more burning. If we think about the goals, what I call peace, prosperity, and planet, these are all global issues. And so we have to rejuvenate in as well the international systems, which rest ultimately on the sovereignty of states, but must in crucial ways transcend them. None of this is going to be simple to do, but that's the sort of agenda I tried to set out. A lot of the book is about the relations between democracies and autocracies. Personal dictatorships are pretty poor regimes. They suffer from absolutely fundamental problems. The evidence from history and from recent experience is pretty clear that democratic systems, not least because they can get rid of bad rulers without violence. I mean, a point I made about Britain's last two prime ministers, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, is that they were dismissed in the end. They weren't very good, that's sure, but they were dismissed in the end without violence. There was no civil war, it was peaceful, it was overnight, and they were gone. That's impossible to do in an autocracy. China, I suppose Vietnam, is a very different thing. Here you have institutions, the Communist Party, it's quite meritocratic, and that in China is rooted in the Chinese bureaucratic Mandarin tradition. They are competent, their promotion is carefully overseen, and they have been remarkably effective in securing very rapid development. But I think here too, you can perfectly well see some fundamental structural problems. Deng Xiaoping was unique in trying to institutionalize rotation of power and institutionalize non-concentration of power, but that's gone. And Xi Jinping has come along, actually, quite legitimately say this system became very, very corrupt and the people don't like it. But the price of tackling corruption in his system, not a rule of law system, which is so crucial for a democratic capitalism, is of course centralized control and putting vast numbers of people in prison. The bureaucrats are frightened of doing anything because they will be condemned for being corrupt, and the business people are frightened of doing anything because they will be frightened of being corrupting and they won't get the permissions anyway. Even a very complex institutionalized dictatorship like China, let alone a more personal bureaucracy. This is the least bad system by far, and for precisely the reason that it institutionalizes business competition and political competition and doesn't allow the emergence of either economic or political monopolies which are unchallengeable. And that's the essence of the system that one is trying to protect. By its nature, it creates new opportunities for altering, interfering with, or even damaging the flow of information in our society. But one of the most remarkable things about human society as a whole is that it has been and always has been an information processing system. The AI bots will know all that, and they can produce just the stories that will work on you or on me, on anyone watching this, and that could completely pollute the information processing system of our society. This really frightens me. For those who want the quality that we try to provide, and a few other news organizations try to provide, this is an opportunity to be even better. Why is right-wing populism so successful? And particularly, why does a populism that is based on fear and anger rather than a populism based on hope and aspiration so much stronger? And is that innate as a natural tendency of human beings, or is it something specific to our own civilization? So these are some of the things that I would have liked to explore more. If we want democracy, which I really do believe has been the most successful system, above all because it means you can't ignore people and you can get change without violence. those of us who've been lucky enough to live in such a society, for all its flaws, it's unbelievably valuable, beautiful, and I want to defend it and extend it. Because I'm Martin Wolf. I'm the Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times. Well, the book discusses the emergence of populism, and particularly autocratic or authoritarian versions of populism across much of the democratic world, including some countries like the US and UK, but also others, which everybody thought had completely consolidated, well-established democracies. And it analyzes why this has occurred and argues in essence that at least in the case of these countries, but I think more broadly, a crucial element has been economic disappointment and economic failures, which have made a large part of the population fear for their future, distrust the elites in charge, both governmental and in business, and open then to the seduction by charismatic demagogues, mostly of the right. And that's the dominant theme of the book, which then goes on to discuss how this has happened and what might be done about it. Well, I wrote the book because I sort of felt I had to. You don't really start with the idea of what it's going to do for a reader. You start, or the books I've written, and I think it's true of many people, with a feeling that something important is going on that you want to understand for yourself. It's a process of discovery, often self-discovery, which you only really get by working through issues rigorously, and the book is the best way to do it. And why did I want to understand this? I suppose the project, in my mind, started in 2016, and it was triggered by two very specific events. There were other things going on in the world, but these events were dominant. And one was the rise of Donald Trump and his then imminent election as President of the United States, and the other was the Brexit campaign. And that these events forced me to ask myself, why, since I hadn't expected this, was this happening? How significant was it? How did it fit in with the wider erosion of democracy across the world, which we already knew about? How did it relate to the financial crisis, which I just discussed in my previous book, The Shifts and the Shocks? That was what triggered this. And it turned out to be a 5 or 6 years effort to do this, because I do the books in my spare time, but also because it was just much more difficult for me, involved far more difficult and complex issues with which I was not familiar than anything I'd done before. Well, I suppose there are two very important differences, but one similarity, in that they were triggered by what I thought were dangerous ideas, which I wanted to combat. In the case of the globalization book, the trigger, which is interesting given what's happened since, was attacks predominantly by Westerners on the idea that developing countries could benefit from globalization. And I felt very passionately that that was a mistake, that in fact globalization was going to benefit a very, very large proportion of people in successful globalizing developing countries. And I still believe that, not changed my view on that at all. And there's not that much in that book that I would reject. There are a few things. But this book was triggered by something very different, attacks on the idea of democracy, which I didn't think was in danger 25 years ago when I started on globalization, from within the developed world. And So had a very different concern. Its focus is the developed world, not developing countries. Its focus is not economics, but politics, and it's linked with economics. So the big difference is I was looking at a different phenomenon. But in the process, there were certainly some aspects of the first book, the relative confidence in markets, the relative indifference to the impact in high-income developed countries of changes in the world economy on income distribution and the position of the working class, that I concluded were a mistake. So I think it's quite useful to discuss where I'm still in the same place. And probably the most important ones where I'm still in the same place is that I thought in that first book that there were very real dangers with free financial markets. That's already in my first book. And I also argued in my first book that it was perfectly possible and desirable to pay to establish a working welfare state while globalizing. There was no contradiction between these two things, as you could see from some of the most successful developed countries in Europe, like Denmark or Sweden. They have a welfare state and they're very open. And I also continue to believe, and that's in my last book, that though this is the focus of complaint, trade has not been a dominant reason or even a particularly important reason for the problems in developed countries. So in this respect, I think there's consistency. And finally, I continue to believe that the market economy, broadly defined, is, with some qualifications, the best way to generate prosperity. It's the one system that has been proven to do so, and I remain supportive of that. All this is continuous. The big change, I think, is I'm much more aware than I used to be of the dangers domestically of free financial markets and what's called the financialization of the economy. I was not as aware of that as I should have been. I focused more on the international side, and I was much less aware than I should have been that it would be an enormous failure, and it was an enormous failure, if we didn't help people really strongly to adjust to the vast changes that the ongoing technological transformation and trade transformation and financial transformations that were happening. I was too convinced that the economy will be able to make these adjustments without that much government assistance. And so I finally came to the view that a very famous thinker, Karl Polanyi, who insisted that we couldn't have completely free labor markets, treating labor as a commodity just like any other commodity, would prove politically impossible and ultimately incompatible with democracy. And that's something that I didn't realize, or certainly didn't think 20 years ago with the clarity I do now. Well, that's a very big question. Let's start with the economists. I think that really gets very difficult. I think that, as I've mentioned already, I became very convinced by this sociologist, political economist, I don't know exactly how you describe him, Karl Polanyi, who published his book on this topic in 1944, which, as it happens, was the same year as Hayek's Road to Serfdom was published, a book that had and has influenced me a great deal, but from whose ideas I have shifted quite a bit in Karl Polanyi's direction. Apart from that, John Maynard Keynes has become again, a very important influence upon me, and that really started with the book on the financial crisis, The Shifts and the Shocks. He's not such a big figure here, of contemporary economists, and I cite this at some length, Darren Acemoglu and Robinson's book, The Narrow Corridor, which is about essentially the narrow width of political territory that allows you, and political and economic territory that allows you to have a thriving democracy. And I use that idea, though I refer to it as fragility. That book was published a few years ago and certainly influenced me a great deal. There are many other books, but probably these are the ones that are these old thinkers and new thinkers that are most important. In terms of the philosophers and broader thinkers, Adam Smith is cited a great deal because competition matters, and one of the things that worries me is the erosion of competition and the emergence of monopoly and the corruption that tends to generate in distorting the political system. So Smith is very important. I mentioned David Hume in defense of universal suffrage democracy, because he says, if I remember correctly, I don't know whether it'll be exact, that reason is and always ought to be a slave of the passions. And that's a very powerful, it is, I think, correct, a powerful argument against this idea that only educated elites should have the vote, because I argue that actually everybody is self-interested and subject to emotion. But the really important philosophical figures are far earlier than any of these, namely the founders of our thought about politics in the West, namely Plato and Aristotle, both of whom are cited at some length, and whose thinking about democracy, Plato was against it, Aristotle was more analytical, but nonetheless is incredibly rich and has enormous lessons for us. And I went back to them because I read classics at Oxford, and I found their thinking immensely helpful in crystallizing the concerns I had. So that's really difficult. So I think the core of my argument, in a way, is that the underlying idea, which is also a value in democracy, is that of citizenship. Citizens are active, engaged, and they are committed to the whole, to the, as it were, the society as a whole, over and above their commitment to their particular interests or their particular ideologies. If you're going to have a democracy, I think this is the most important point I make, it's not original, of course, you have to accept the legitimacy of people who disagree with you and their right to power if they win. And that also means you accept their right to argue against you freely, associate and organize with one another and organize themselves against you if you win. And to do that, I think, you have to have a sense that your citizenship, your being part of the society as a whole, is more important than your identification with the people who happen to agree with you today. And so underlying the diversity of democracy, there must be a sense of a common bond, and that's what citizenship captures. There must also be institutions correspondingly supported by values, it's not just institutions, which ensure that nobody treats a victory in an election as a permanent transfer of power and therefore an entitlement to suppress those who disagree with you. Because if you do that, sometimes now called an illiberal democracy, you're on the way to autocracy. Now, how do you get this sense of citizenship? What makes that happen? Well, there are many conditions for that. Some sense of shared values, some sense of shared experiences, perhaps shared ideas and values, but also a sense that among everybody that the society is looking after them, that none of them is an afterthought. And I point out this sort of wonderful quote, which is to me the most important quote in the book, from Aristotle, who says, and for me it fits beautifully with Polanyi's work, who basically says that if you want a democracy to survive, the middle classes, the middle of, you know what we mean, the people in the middle of the income distribution need to feel they are powerful, they are listened to, they are respected, and they have a real say. And that depends in large part on their being prosperous enough to be independent, to have the time to get engaged in politics, not to be isolated from the rest, and above all, not to feel that there's an elite ruling over them that is essentially indifferent to them or even despises them. That's partly about a degree of income equality, but it's partly about a sense that they have value in society. Their ideas and values are important. And that idea goes with citizenship. And I argue that the successful democracies, the ones that are enduringly successful, are relatively egalitarian. And when you get extreme inequalities, you tend to get plutocrats at one end with an overwhelming say in politics, particularly through their money, and a relatively impoverished majority which feels impotent. And they use their votes to elect demagogues with autocratic impulses who say, we will look after you. And that's, I think, what's happened. What can you do about this? Well, making people feel economically secure and reasonably prosperous, and making people feel that even if everybody doesn't agree with them, that their values are important within reason. There are lots of things you can't accept. Outright racism, that's obvious. Everybody has to be entitled to a place, but they have to feel that there is respect for them. This is a very difficult balance. This is why democracy is so fragile. But those are, I think, the necessary conditions for a thriving democracy. And it seems to me obvious that in many parts of the world, including our countries, we have lost those conditions, or at least made them very fragile. So I think that it's perfectly possible that, particularly under stress, particularly in times of conflict, internal or external, that human societies naturally tend to congregate around a charismatic leader. It simplifies decision making, and it provides a focus for trust. And if you cease, in particular, to trust institutions and the people who run institutions because they seem to be dysfunctional, the natural tendency of human beings seems to be to trust a charismatic great leader. And this is repeated innumerable times in human history. So I suspect that that sort of hierarchical, tribal response to fear and danger is pretty hardwired. So the way I think about it is, if things are frightening, you go tribal, and if you go tribal, you tend to seek a leader who will be your tribal leader. And we've seen it in the past in many different ways. We saw it with Napoleon, and we saw it with Hitler, and we're seeing a bit of that now. They're different, but we're seeing it all across the world. So I think it is natural in that sense. But that doesn't mean it's universal or preordained, because if you run society well enough, there are other aspects of human beings. They want to be engaged in public life. They want to feel that they are valued and have a say. And if they do feel that, they're perfectly prepared to be engaged and to prevent the emergence of despots. That's also we've seen, or indeed to fight for these values. So that seems also to be part of human beings' nature and experiences. And the way I think about this is that we are a social animal, but we are an unbelievably complex social animal that has different desires and impulses. The question then you ask is, okay, if that's the case, and we want to preserve democracy, and we want to have it last, then how do we do this institutionally? Well, here are a few elements. We need to have a political process which generates trustworthy leaders. That's not easy. And I think we've not done a great job at this. We need to have a political process and institutions which generate expertise, because we have very complex societies, that is trustworthy too. And we haven't done a very good job on that either. We need people to feel that their wishes and desires are actually represented through the political process. And I feel that when money becomes a dominant element in public life, in how you influence things, people will feel that politicians are less and less representative of them, and they will then turn to some outsider to speak for them. And Plato talks a lot about that. So that was true 2,500 years ago. So I think the elements of a good democratic society, which is a mixture of accountability and representation with, when necessary, trustworthy expertise, is that mixture, that blend, is the essential characteristics. Very complicated. I think it's obvious we've lost that or have been losing that. I don't think it's impossible to repair it. One must be optimistic, but one has to recognize then that it requires quite a large number of reforms, both in the political system, which we've just been discussing, and in the economy itself, to make people feel they are part of the whole and that the whole values them. Well, I would say that crony capitalism is a subset of rentier capitalism. Rentier capitalism is essentially a system in which people are rewarded not for the value of their innovations, but for their ability to manipulate markets, all sorts of markets, in ways that shift income from, quite often, the people who have generated the incomes to themselves. It's a system in which a mixture of power with monopolies of various kinds shifts rewards to a privileged few. And it goes back to the notion of, which is what I've been talking about, pre-modern societies in which the wealth was created by the peasantry, but on the basis of their work on the land, but the rental value of the land, which in fact was being generated by everybody who worked the land in a peasant society, was actually expropriated or appropriated by the landowners, not by the people at large, by landowners. What were landowners doing? Well, they were possibly providing a bit of protection, but essentially they controlled the state, and they used the state to guarantee their own property rights over land which they hadn't created, they hadn't produced anything, they were just extracting resources. And this extremely unjust structure, in my view, was the normal way that complex pre-modern societies worked in the great empires, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire, the Chinese Empire. That's how it was structured. My notion, it actually goes back to Adam Smith, though he didn't use quite this term, of rentier capitalism, monopoly more broadly, is a application of that idea to a more modern society in which people, by virtue of their ownership of companies, allow them to extract all the rental element in the income of companies, which is a very large one, for their benefit and not for the economy as large. Either they prevent taxation, and have lots of information on the distortion of the tax system because of political power of the monopolists, and directly in the enterprise, the way the enterprise is structured to extract the rent for a very small number, the shareholders of course, but also particularly for the management. And that's rentier capitalism. It's an application of this idea of rent and rental value extracted by dominant elites to a capitalist system. And I concluded, somewhat painfully, I must admit, that that was quite a large feature of our system, and it is part of the reason why inequality has risen and in many countries, and it's part of the reason why people are so frustrated. There are many reasons for this, but it's a structure which is, I think, a pretty natural outgrowth of deregulated capitalism, not an inevitable one, particularly if ownership rights are structured in the way they tend to be in our society. I put forward what I call a New Deal, and the economic side, and I suggest a number of fairly complex political reforms to improve the situation. And I put forward this as a sort of agenda, not the last word. So let me just discuss the elements. First of all, crucially, the objectives. The objective is to make citizens feel dignity in their lives, some security in their lives, ability to plan their lives, and opportunity for themselves and their children. They have to feel that they have the possibility of a decent life. And I think particularly the developed countries, are rich enough to be able to afford this. Now that involves many elements, but I can discuss some of them. We have to invest quite heavily in education so that people have the possibility of getting good jobs. We have to ensure that the jobs they can get are good ones. That's partly about promoting and supporting innovation, a very big part. Industrial policy of the right kind can help. But it's also about employment subsidies, about job security, and minimum wages, which I've come round to. I wasn't in favor 20 years ago. I am now, properly done. And the right to organize labor, I think, is important. I think this much more now than I did 20, 30 years ago. I don't want to go back to the trades unions of the 1970s, but I think we've gone too far, if anything, in the opposite direction. We need a tax system that will pay for this, and I think it is completely reasonable that the most successful members of our society should pay these taxes. The tax system is very defective in this regard. Really wealthy people pay very little. Many don't pay hardly anything at all, and that's part of the rent extraction because they can buy the politicians who will support them. And And that links with my very strong desire to reduce the role of money in politics, make it less plutocratic than it is, particularly in the United States, but also here in significant ways. Just think of the role of the Russian oligarchs in this country. So the economics and the politics are linked up in that way. I'm not in favor of a universal basic income. I think it's ill-targeted and too expensive, but I'm quite sure that in a country like the UK and the US, tax rates will have to rise on the richest people in order to achieve these goals. There needs to be a welfare state which provides decent universal healthcare and education. I'm increasingly convinced that we have to do something about housing. In Britain, it's been a huge failure. And the regional issues, the problems of regional poverty are central. Industrial policy will play an important part in making regional policy work better. There has to be an integration there. The politics, and I think here we do need to think about quite important reforms. I think that first past the post electoral systems are quite problematic, that I'm not in favor of complete proportionality, but the sort of system they have in Ireland where you get the possibility of alternative votes, one idea, but basically systems in which people can rank their candidates, and the second and third and fourth votes are distributed from the losing candidates to the people who are higher up. So in the end, this tends to force the outcome towards the middle instead of an overrepresentation of the extreme. I think that a lot of reform is needed of our bureaucratic systems, making them more expert, and if anything, in some important ways, more independent. But those are complicated technical things we have to do. A huge concern is the role of the media and the way the media now works. As public service broadcasting deteriorates, everybody goes into an echo chamber. There's no longer a common set of shared facts, which is, I think, crucial. Alternative facts, as they're called, i.e. lies. And I'm not clear that there's a simple solution, but I do think we need to start thinking about what a common media space would look like for democracy in the future. I think we're beginning to think about this, and with artificial intelligence now, I think that with the possibility of immensely sophisticated fakery, this issue is even more burning. There aren't any simple answers, but hugely important. And finally, there's an issue which crosses over between the economics and the politics, which is how we handle immigration. My position is sort of semi-controversial in the sense that I believe that countries are entitled to decide who live there, and who can be a citizen. But I also think we do need generous immigration policies. Somehow, very difficult. We have to get away from simplistic xenophobia on the one hand, while at the same time not saying, well, actually there are no controls at all, because that's going to be completely politically unacceptable. I should add, finally, this isn't just about nations, it's also about global relations. Democracies have to cooperate with one another and with other countries. So we can't discuss these issues as purely national. If we think about the goals, what I call peace, prosperity, and planet, these are all global issues. And so we have to rejuvenate in as well the international systems which rest ultimately on the sovereignty of states, but must in crucial ways transcend them. None of this is going to be simple to do, but that's the sort of agenda I tried to set out. A lot of the book is about the relations between democracies and autocracies. My broad argument is that if you compare democracies with most autocracies, which tend to be personal dictatorships in which there is a dominant ruler, often somebody nowadays who came to power through democracy and then made himself dictator, suppressing elections and so forth. It's basically always been a him, so it's reasonable to say himself. I think it's pretty clear that personal dictatorships are pretty poor regimes. They suffer from absolutely fundamental problems, which is that government is arbitrary. The dictator tends to have a set of cronies, political and economic, whom he favors. Over time, the dictator becomes, because it's just sort of on his own, more arbitrary, more isolated, more defensive about what he himself has done, and simply put, more irrational. So I think that the evidence from history and from recent experience is pretty clear that democratic systems, not least because they can get rid of bad rulers without violence. I mean, a point I made about Britain's last two prime ministers, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, is that they were dismissed in the end. They weren't very good, that's sure, but they were dismissed in the end without violence. There was no civil war, it was peaceful, it was overnight, and they were gone. That's impossible to do in an autocracy. They couldn't do that in all the many autocracies around the world without lots of people dying, civil wars, horrors. So all this is a tremendous advertisement for the glories of a well-established, a legitimate democratic process. Now, China, I suppose Vietnam, is a very different thing. Here you have institutions, the Communist Party, it's quite meritocratic, and that in China is rooted in the Chinese bureaucratic Mandarin tradition. They are competent, their promotion is carefully overseen, and they have been remarkably effective in securing very rapid development. But I think here too, you can perfectly well see some fundamental structural problems. First, somebody can capture the state. Mao did, and really Xi Jinping is now doing that. He's there indefinitely. He's showing many of the characteristics of dictators who've been in power too long, being too isolated, making erratic decisions like the way he handled COVID, ignoring advice, becoming essentially an increasingly isolated figure, and I think it's very unlikely to get better. Deng Xiaoping was unique in trying to institutionalize rotation of power and institutionalize non-concentration of power, but that's gone. And these are all the fundamental weaknesses of dictators throughout, of absolute monarchies or dictators throughout the ages, and you're seeing it again. And since you mentioned it, China is still relatively poor, has some very big economic problems, the demographic problem, the declining productivity growth, excess savings, excess debt, and they're not dealing with this because that is what the regime has produced, and they don't like abandoning what they produce. And then the final problem they have, which is very important, is that in a regime like this, there is no rule of law. So if you're going to be successful in business, you get successful by your connections with bureaucrats who control resources like land, above all. The bureaucrats control resources. And so naturally the latter, the bureaucrats, want to share in the wealth. And the wealthy want to get these goodies from the bureaucrats. So they corrupt them, and they corrupt one another. And Xi Jinping has come along, actually, quite legitimately say this system became very, very corrupt and the people don't like it. But the price of tackling corruption in his system, not a rule of law system, which is so crucial for a democratic capitalism, is of course centralized control and putting vast numbers of people in prison and attacking the corrupting business people. And of course that stops them from doing anything. In fact, the bureaucrats are frightened of doing anything because they will be condemned for being corrupt. And the business people are frightened of doing anything because they will be frightened of being corrupting and they won't get the permissions anyway. So my view is that what we are seeing now is a very good example, are very good examples of why in the long run, despite all the mess, a liberal and democratic society is much better than a dictatorship, even a very complex, institutionalized dictatorship like China, let alone a more personal bureaucracy. This is the least bad system by far, and for precisely the reason that it institutionalizes business competition and political competition and doesn't allow the emergence of either economic or political monopolies which are unchallengeable. And that's the essence of the system that one is trying to protect. I think that now I would like to, it would have meant a lot of work, but I think I would like to explore a bit in a more complex ways the role of cultural change in shaping the discontent of so many people, and how societies with very divergent values can still keep together. This is this deep problem. I discussed it a bit of how you have enough social unity to run a democracy, a peaceful, which involves the peaceful transfer of power from one group to another, and the legitimacy of that peaceful process. That requires a strong sense of identification with one another. And the question is whether in a deeply divided society that can be sustained. And I would have liked to think more about that. I would have probably liked to think more about where the economy is going. Because a big point that, I discussed it a bit, but a big point in my book is that a large part of what has undermined the democratic settlement of the post-war period in the West is economic change that was inevitable, deindustrialization, and with it the collapse of the industrial working class. The new technologies, which have been so disruptive and have tended to atomize the media and atomize our relations with one another. They've eroded a lot of the civic association on which, as Tocqueville teaches us in Democracy in America, our societies really depend. So these new technologies are crucial, and I would have liked to spend more time still on how to make them work within a democratic framework. And then, of course, if I'd been more aware of what artificial intelligence was going to bring, I would have been even more concerned about that, because it's clear that it is going to be immensely disruptive on top of all the other disruptions we have. And so I think the challenges of sustaining a stable democratic order, which came out of the 19th and early 20th centuries, now a long time ago, are even greater than I had thought. And perhaps the final thing, it's not quite doesn't quite fit in what I last said, but it fits with some of the earlier things about culture, is why is right-wing populism so successful? And particularly, why does a populism that is based on fear and anger rather than a populism based on hope and aspiration, so much stronger? And is that innate as a natural tendency of human beings? When they get frightened, when they're upset, they close, they want to build walls, metaphorically and in reality, cultural walls, religious walls, actual walls, ethnic walls. Is that really what it's about? So it really is what inevitably happens, or is it something specific to our own civilization? So these are some of the things that I would have liked to explore more, but it would have had to be in another book, because I already had so much to cover in the book I've written, and I cut it down by about 40,000 words from the first draft, and I really wouldn't want to cut any of that back further. And I'm not the expert to write these other books, but I think if we want democracy, which I really do believe has been the most successful system, above all because it means you can't ignore people and you can get change without violence. This idea of a rotation of power holders, which is consensual and non-violent, is an extraordinary idea. I mean, it's unbelievably rare and in much of the world still revolutionary. And for those of us who've been lucky enough to live in such a society, for all its flaws, it's unbelievably valuable, beautiful. And I want to defend it and extend it, because I think it's the most fully human system, because ultimately it is based on the idea that every one of us is entitled to security, to protection, and a right to participate in public life. And it's a great idea which to a significant extent we have achieved, and we need to make better. I think the answer is I don't know. I really don't know. What has happened in the last year or two with AI has been quite a surprise to me. Maybe it shouldn't have been. But there are at least two ways it might be a threat. The first is, and this links with the dominant theme of my book, it's going to create a whole new wave of economic change. I mean, it's obvious. I don't know what that change will look like, but it seems plausible that a lot of people will lose jobs. There will be new jobs, but they may not be got by the people who had the old jobs. Many of the people who lose jobs may be people in the sort of middle classes, so very important groups, people like paralegals and X-ray specialists. I mean, all sorts of people who have very valuable skills which involve pattern recognition, which machines are going to do instead. What will the net impact of that on the labor market? How quick will adjustments be? How many people will lose jobs and opportunities, particularly people coming out of universities? We don't know. But if it's a really big shock to the middle classes, that will have political consequences, for sure. I have no idea. It may turn out to be relatively small, considering the huge shocks we've already gone through in the computer and information age, but who knows? The second effect, which seems pretty obvious, is by its nature, it creates new opportunities for altering, interfering with, or even damaging the flow of information in our society. One way of thinking about human society, there are many different ways, but one of the most remarkable things about human society as a whole is that it has been and always has been an information processing system. You might even say that defines what a human society is. It's an information processing system. It's also a system for generating economic specialization and cooperation, and that's made human beings incomparably the most effective species on the planet. Now, AI is clearly going to be another important change in our information processing system. It could be used to improve the quality of what we're getting, because maybe AI can be used as really effective fact and information checkers. But of course, it can also be used, and we know this, to produce very high quality fake pictures, fake quotations, fake stories. They can be tailor-made to fit the prejudices and desires of particular people, because they will know all that. The AI bots will know all that, and they can produce just the stories that will work on you or on me, on anyone watching this, and that could completely pollute the information processing system of our society. Wild rumors of all kinds can be created and by rumor I mean any distorted information can be created and shipped around the world in a blink of an eye. It's pretty frightening. And given what I think has already been the immense damage done by some of our social media to our young people particularly, this really frightens me. So these two things together mean that there are, no doubt, great opportunities here, but also enormous dangers, and they do worry me. Well, since the news media are the professionalization of the information flow, they've already been madly affected by the new media environment. For some of us, I think at the FT, where I work, it's been an improvement. We have a much closer relationship with our subscribers. We know who they are. They access us in a better way than with the old newspaper. You know, the internet version is better, more complete, better referenced. They're very happy to pay for our quality. And the AI addition to this will allow us, I think, to do our research better, while still ensuring that the ultimate quality control of a human writing the stuff on the basis of the best information they have will continue to apply. There will be, I'm sure mistakes will be made, but I think on balance, AI can improve our business. But we only have a little over 1 million subscribers. In the world as a whole, that's a pretty small part of the information and communication processing. And in general, high quality media, which are independent, well, they don't exist in many countries at all. And even where they do, there are lots of other forms of media which are in the business of getting clicks. And they do this by generating outrage and other destructive emotions. And I fear that AI can produce even more perfectly targeted and invented conspiracy theories and conspiracies that look like reality than we've already got. I mean, that's bad enough. So I think for those who want the quality that we try to provide, and a few other news organizations try to provide, this is an opportunity to be even better. But I do fear that the opportunity to do destructive things even better too might prove overwhelming. And I think we certainly need, ideally, a sort of policy for this. That's what justified creating, back in the 1920s, 100 years ago, the BBC. And I think that it was a great creation, and it served this country and the world, actually, very well. And we're losing it. We're clearly losing it. In America, public service broadcasting has more or less disappeared. And if we look at American politics, this has not gone well. The ease with which lies have become central to American public life, the widespread acceptance of the lies about what happened in the last election, completely novel phenomenon in my lifetime. I mean, before this, nobody went around saying what had happened in the last election, the presidential election in the United States, the most important election in the world, didn't happen. And what allows that? Well, partly perverse human beings, but even more, the ability to create an echo chamber. So I think AI might make this worse, and it frightens me again. I mean, and because media is not only a business in its own right, which of course it is, but it's much more important than that. And it's, as a business, the media isn't very important. There are many, many far bigger businesses. But without reliable media, I think there can neither be honest and decent business nor honest and decent politics. So, because the media are the communication form for our societies en masse, and therefore I don't really care what happens to the media as a business, though it needs to survive. But what matters is the role that media can play in our wider society, and that's where the risks lie.